Hello and welcome to Bicep for Real episode 4. This week we're going to start tackling the containers and how we run our containers in the application. Now this is a fairly big chunk of work, so I'm going to break it down into two or more parts. We'll see how it goes. The first part today we're going to have a look at is getting some of the prerequisite work done that will allow us to then run those containers. So let's get into that. So if you remember, we're working on the Lambda Toys digital store project. They want to take their new API and deploy that as a service into the internet using Azure. And so we're going to be looking at doing that. And this is our initial diagram of the environment we're going to look at. And we've already tackled some of that. We've got the VNet down, we've got the Azure Cosmos DB, private endpoints, network security groups. So now we need to look at the piece in the middle there about how we're going to host our containers. And there are a few different options that we could look at for hosting containers. There's things like Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. There is Azure Web Apps. There is Azure Container Instances. And there is a new service called Azure Container Apps. Now, they all have different benefits, pros and cons, and so on. And you can go into those in a bit more detail in some of the other articles I've got. But basically, we need to pick one of those. We're going to discount a few initially. So ACI is a nice service, but ACI is really based around deploying a container. It's a completely serverless container solution, but it's not really designed for really running full-blown microservices. If you remember from the requirements, which we'll have a quick look at here, we've got requirements for using Dapper, which is that microservice framework. That's not something we can run on ACI. So we will get rid of that one straight out of the bat. Similarly for web apps, we can't really run Dapper on that either. Web apps are a pretty nice environment for running containers, and you can run more than one container, but they're not really set up for full microservice deployments. So it leaves us really with AKS and ACA. And what we are going to go with is ACA because AKS is a great solution and it's very flexible and it's it has a lot of different options to work with. But it has some downsides, and the primary two we're thinking of here are firstly around cost. AKS can be quite expensive. It's based on VM node sizes and it can get quite large, but also complexity. AKS, you're deploying basically a full Kubernetes cluster. You then have to populate it with your resources. So not just your applications, but you need an ingress controller. You need something to deal with certificates. You need all the different services that go along with that. And then you have to manage it. You have to apply updates to the Kubernetes cluster. You have to deploy node updates and so on. Now, some of that you can automate, but it's still quite a chunk of management overhead. ACA, however, is effectively designed as a serverless type platform for running Kubernetes type applications and particularly microservices, and it comes with a lot of services built in. So we'll have a look at that. So this is some of the reasons why. First up, and this is a big one for this course, is the fact that we can deploy everything with Bicep. This is one of the failings of Bicep and ARM versus something like Terraform or Pulumi is that Bicep is purely about deploying Azure resources. Now, up till now, that's not really been an issue. But once we start looking at if we deployed AKS, once we've got AKS deployed, we need to install things like ingress controllers. We need to install Dapper and those sort of things. And it's more difficult to do that. Now, some of those have plugins, like Dapper does have a plugin for AKS, so not so much of an issue, but the ingress controller is probably a good one. If you want to use Nginx as your ingress controller, you've got to deploy like a Helm chart or similar to it. And there's no way to do that from Bicep. We'd have to run some sort of script in our pipeline or maybe using the script functionality within Bicep, but it's much harder to get those resources into the Kubernetes cluster. Whereas with ACA, you actually deploy the containers onto the cluster using Bicep, and everything else like ingress and so on is built in for you. So we can deploy the entire service using Bicep. As I mentioned, it's got lower management overhead. We don't have to do Kubernetes updates and that sort of stuff. It's done for us. It's got services built in. It's got ingress for us. It's got Dapper. It's got certificates. It's got service bus, service mesh, those sort of things already built in. So it comes with a lot of things we need. It still supports VNet join, so we can add it to our VNet to use the private link. This is a relatively new add-on, but does do that. And in theory, the cost should be lower. Now, one thing to bear in mind with this is ACA is still in preview. So we are sort of pushing our luck a bit here in that we're using a preview service, which we wouldn't put into production. My assumption is by the time we get to the end of this, we'll be reaching a point where it will go into GA. but it's something to be aware if you're, if you're trying to look at something yourself, just think about whether or not it being a preview service is going to be an issue for you. So this is what our new design looks at. We've got ACA in the middle there, so we're going to add that in. And then there's a couple of extra things we've added, which is a key vault and a container registry. So the key vault we're going to use to store some secrets that we need for our container app. In particular, one of the downsides of container apps at the moment is it doesn't support managed identity. I'm sure it will by the time it goes to GA, but it doesn't currently. And so when it needs to access the container registry to get the container images, it needs some credentials for that. And so we're going to put those into Key Vault. And then obviously we need a container registry to put the images into that they're going to be consumed by the container app. So the assumption is that this registry would then be, the developers would push their images to that, and then we would consume them from there. So we're going to go ahead now and start looking at deploying this. As I mentioned, we're not going to do the whole end-to-end container piece today because that would take too long for one episode. I think we need to keep these fairly short. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to get some of the prereqs that we need for the containers pieces deployed. So in particular, the container registry, the key vault, and the container apps environment, which is basically the cluster that's going to then run our environment, our applications. We also need to make some networking changes because we need to add some subnets that are going to be used by ACA on the network. And so we'll go and do that as part of our template changes as well. And so by the end of the episode, we'll have everything ready. The next episode, we will be able to then deploy the container applications. So let's get started with that. Okay, so first thing, before we start looking at any of the container app pieces, we need to sort out our virtual network. So if you remember from the previous installment, when we deployed our VNet, this is the code we used, and we used this VNet settings object to tell the template what we wanted to configure our VNet with. And at that time, we just deployed one subnet with a /22 range. With ACA, because we're going to go and join that to the virtual network, it needs to have two dedicated subnets that are used purely for ACA, an app subnet and a control plane subnet. And so we need to add those subnets into our virtual network so they're available for it to use. So first thing is we're going to edit this up. We're going to copy the subnet section. And remember, this is the sort of default value we're passing in, which you can use as is. People don't have to specify it, but if people do want to change it, they've got a template here because remember, there's no required value option for objects in Bicep. So we'll just do that twice, and we're going to call these name, and we're going to use this name later. So we want to kind of make a standard name for this. We'll call it ACA app subnet, and we'll call it ACA control subnet. And then we need to set the IP ranges. And if you're like me and you can't do subnet maths in your head or remember them, there's a very useful website I use all the time, which we'll just quickly have a quick look at. So this is the visual subnet calculator, and it's really easy to sort of split up a subnet. So we know that our virtual network is using the 10.0.0.0/20 range. So we'll update that. And this will give us so there's 4094 addresses in that. If we divide that, and we divide it again on each of those to get some /22s. You can see the prefix here, or suffix, sorry. And so these are our /22s. We're already using this top one, so we know those next two, we can use the .4 and the .8 version. So it's a really useful tool to quickly do subnet maths if you're terrible at it like me. So back in code, we'll just come in here and we'll change these to use a 10.4 and a 10.8. And that should be all we need. That will then redeploy the VNet, and because we're just looping through that array in here, we don't have to go and change the actual Bicep code. We're just changing the parameters that are being passed in. And back over in the portal, we have a quick look at the subnets. We've now got those two new subnets that are ready for use with our container app. Now, quickly, we're going to have to come back to our VNet options because after I set this all up, I realized I'd made a mistake. So the ACA subnets have a minimum size of a /21, which is pretty large, and I'm hoping that requirement will get reduced when we get past preview. But what that does mean is what we've got here won't work. The ACA will fail to deploy, and we need to change them to /21 because our VNet is a /20 at the moment. There isn't enough room for 3 /21s, which is a bit of a problem. So basically going to have to change this to be a /19. And if we go visit the wonderful subnet calculator again. We're going to use the 8 and 16 options. So make that 8, 16 and change those to a /21. There we go. And if I try and deploy that now, it's going to fail because it's going to tell me that the subnets, they need to delete and recreate the subnets, and there are things in the subnet, primarily the private endpoint for the Cosmos DB, and it's going to complain about those. So the easiest thing, because we're in development mode, and you will find you do this frequently, but sometimes in the development world, is the easiest thing is just go and delete everything and redeploy it. Because everything's defined in the template, that's a lot easier because we're not making any manual configuration. We can just basically go in and delete the resource group and then redeploy it. So that's what I'll do now. We will go back to our resource group, copy the name and go ahead and delete resource group. And if we go, and that's going to go and delete that. And then once that's done, we can go ahead and redeploy it, and it should recreate everything for us with the right subnet sizes. So sorry about that. Hopefully you hadn't deployed it yet when you got to this part, but you will need to recreate it with those subnet sizes. In addition to the subnets, we also need some extra resources. So we mentioned before, we're going to need a container registry that our developers can push their images into. And then we're going to need a key vault because we need to store the credentials for that container registry so that the container apps can use it. Container apps, unfortunately, at the moment doesn't support managed identity. And so if we want to talk to the container registry, we have to supply it with some credentials, and we don't want to be passing them around as plain text. So we're going to pass them in as a secret coming from Key Vault, which means we need to get that secret into Key Vault in the first place. So we're going to go ahead and amend our existing template to add these in in the core section. So we'll scroll down to the bottom after all this Cosmos stuff. And first up, we're going to add the container registry. So there is a container registry snippet in here, and we're going to call it we're going to use the prefix and then stick ACR on the end. Now this won't work because ACR is one of those resources where the name doesn't actually support anything other than alphanumeric characters. And if you remember, we're passing in the name as lambda-dev or lbd-dev or something like that. The hyphen in there is going to cause us a problem. Now, obviously, we could go back and change that and not use that as our prefix, but there's nothing to stop somebody doing that. So what we're going to do instead is we are going to use the replace function with that to basically tell it to replace any dashes with basically delete them. And that will solve that problem if we pass any of those in. Location's already set. The SKU will stick with basic for this. That's fine. We need to set admin user enabled. So as I said, we need credentials for the container registry. There are two ways to get credentials for this. There is the admin user, which is a username password that it generates for you, or you can use tokens. Tokens are a nice thing where you can actually just generate a new set of credentials that does and give it specific rights. So it only has ACR pull or push or so on. Now they would be the better option to use, but they are only supported on the premium SKU of ACR, which you might not want to use. So for this example, we'll stick with using the admin user. Ideally, you want to use tokens if you can go to the premium SKU, but I appreciate not everyone can do that. So we'll stick with the admin user. Okay, so that will generate the container registry. Now we need to get a key vault created and put that admin user password into key vault. So let's go ahead and add the key vault here. Now this one, it does have a snippet, but it's a bit old. So the API version here is a bit too old because we want to use the new functionality of Key Vault that allows us to set permissions using Azure RBAC rather than the separate access policies. You really want to move away from them now. So we need to switch this API version to use the 2021-10.01 API version. And we do that because it's going to give us this new option called Enabled RBAC Authorization. I'm going to set that to true. You see we've got a few others here as well. These are all set to true. The one that's really important for us is this one, enable for template deployment, because that will allow our deployment to go and get the secret without us having to go and manually set some permissions on it. So that's a really useful thing to set. I'm going to get rid of the access policy section because we're not using them. They're using RBAC now. And then the tenant ID, when it comes to string, we are going to use the tenant function to get the tenant ID, and that will get us the tenant ID of the current tenant for us. So that'll do it. That'll do that. We'll use a standard SKU, and that should be all you need. Because we're using this enable for template deployment option, we don't actually have to set any permissions on the Key Vault, which if we did, they'd be separate RBAC permission objects now, but we don't actually need to. If you want to go and have a look inside the Key Vault yourself, you currently won't have permissions, so we can change that and add that in here if you wanted to, but I'm not going to. I'm going to leave that as locked down as possible. What we do need to do is get that ACR password in as a secret. So we're also going to create a Key Vault secret. So again, there's a snippet for that, for Key Vault secret. And we're going to use the same syntax to get the name of the Key Vault. And then we're going to call it ACR admin password. That's going to be the name of the secret. And then the value, we are going to need the container registry name. And then there is a list credentials resource on that. And then we want passwords. We want the first password in the list, and we want its value. That will give us, Container Registry has 2 passwords, so you can rotate them. So that will give us the first password in the list, and it will put that into Key Vault for us. And we'll go ahead and deploy that. And once that's done, if we nip over into the Azure portal, and you can see now we've got the Key Vault created, we've got the ACR created, and if we go have a look in here in secrets, we've got this ACR admin user password secret. So that's now ready for us to use when we come to deploy the container register, so the container app. Okay, so now we've got all those prerequisites deployed. We're going to go ahead and start looking at doing the ACA parts. As I mentioned, we're not going to do the whole thing today. We're going to look at deploying the environment and the resources that will run the containers this week. And then we're going to move on to next week. We're going to look at deploying the actual containers, which is a bit more complex. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to split these out into a separate Bicep file so that we can develop them separately to the core pieces. So let's go ahead and create a new file here, and we're going to call it aca.bicep. We're going to copy these 2 parameters from this one because we're going to need those in the ACA one as well. Then we're going to need a few more parameters. Firstly, we're going to deploy the ACA environment into a virtual network. So we need to specify the 2 subnets that are going to be used for that we created in the previous one. Now, we could have parameters to pass in each subnet ID, but to keep things simple, what I'm actually going to do is pass in the VNet ID and make some assumptions on the naming of the subnets being static between the 2 files. So we'll just pass those in as VNet ID, which is a string. And I think that's all we need for the moment. When we add in the containers themselves, we'll probably need more. We might need some more in a minute when I figure them out, but we'll leave that as is in a minute. So the first thing we're going to need to deploy is a log analytics workspace. We need this workspace to be able to store the logs from the container app. So let's go ahead and create that. The snippet for that. And as usual, we'll use our prefix to ensure the right naming convention. That the location's fine, and the SKU, you don't really want to use the free one for anything but dev tests, so we will use the standard option here, and that one's good to go. Next, we are going to look at using the creating the container app environment. Now, that's not got a snippet, so we are going to need to do that ourselves. And so this is the API version we want to use. 2021-0301. Make sure you use this one because that's the one that's got the latest settings, including the VNet piece. So we're going to need a name. Again with a prefix. let's call it container env. We need a location. We need one called kind, which is specific to that one. And the value we need here is container environment. I'm getting all of these details from the ARM/Bicep spec page, which I'll put a link in the below the video as well in case you want to have a look at that. Then we've got our properties section, and we've got a few different options here that we need to use. So the first is environment type, and this needs to be set to managed. This basically tells it we're using ACA. The other type of environments are around Azure Arc and those sort of things. We're not going to be using those. We want to disable the internal load balancer. We're not using that in our setup. Then we need to look at the logs. That's a separate section, and destination here, and this is going to be log analytics. It needs to be spelled exactly like this. Be spelled correctly, but yeah, like analytics. Then we need some information about the log analytics workspace. So we need the custom ID, and this details is going to come from the log analytics workspace. So if we have a look at that, look at the properties, and then there should be a customer ID here. Yep. And then we also need the shared key to be able to look at that. And so we're going to use the log analytics workspace, and we're going to use the list keys function. For some reason, that doesn't get any IntelliSense. And then we're going to go look at the primary shared key is the value we want, I believe. Check my notes. Yep. And then lastly, we're going to do the virtual network configuration. And so that's in the container apps configuration section. And we want the app subnet resource ID. And this is where we're going to use that VNet name property. And then /subnets. And then the name of the subnet. And again, we're making the assumption that subnet name has been named correctly. If you don't like this approach, feel free to add a parameter to it. I was just trying to keep my my parameter list small. And so the same, we're going to use the container app subnet, the control plane, sorry, subnet. And that's going to be a control plane subnet. Okay. And that's going to go ahead and create the cube environment. Now, one thing I remember to mention is this resource type. This is correct as of the recording at the beginning of March 2020. 22, sorry, what year it is. However, over the course of March, Microsoft are transitioning away from the Microsoft.web namespace to the Microsoft.app namespace. And at that point, any existing environments will be moved over, and then this deployment will need to use that namespace instead. They're not running both at the same time, so I can't use the app namespace at the moment. But if you find you try and do this demo and it doesn't work, you're going to want to switch over to the app namespace. Now, we also need to create the parameter file we're going to use for testing this out. So we've got our dev.json parameter file up here, if you remember, and it's got these values in it. It doesn't, though, have the VNet option in here. Now, what you might think is, we'll just add that in here and we'll use the same file for both Bicep files. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. So if we add the VNet in here and then try and use it to deploy the core resources, it will complain that it's got a value that doesn't exist in the template as a parameter. So unfortunately, we do need to create two of those. So what we'll do is we will come here and we will just copy and paste that, and we will call that dev. Now, this is only a temporary thing, because as we start moving into using pipelines to deploy these, we'll get rid of this and we'll start passing parameters around. But for the moment, we are going to stick with this. I'm just going to copy that syntax, and then we're going to rename this to VNet ID. And the value in here needs to be the ID of the VNet we created in the previous one. As I said, once we get to pipelines, what we'll do is we'll push that value as an output of the core template, consume it in our pipeline, and pass it in here. So we won't need to do that. But for the moment, if we just switch over back to the portal. So in the portal, we're just going to go grab the ID of the VNet, which is in this properties section. It's usually the easiest place to find it. There we go. And then back in code, we'll add that in here. And that's our value. Okay, so let's go back to the CLI. and we're running the deployment command. The same command we ran before, we're just changing the names of the files, so ACA files now. Let's run that. Yeah, you see here it's complaining about this not having any types associated. So this is the latest version of the API, but it's not got any types in Bicep. I suspect I probably need to update my Bicep version. It'll be all right. But you can generally ignore that sort of error. It's just usually indicates you need to update. Okay, and that's now completed successfully. It can take a while to do that deployment of the environment, so don't be discouraged if you find you're sat here waiting for quite a long time. It certainly did for me. If we quickly just look in the portal, we've now got this container environment set up. Have a look at that. There's not an awful lot of information in the actual environment. You just see you've got no apps at the moment, which is fine. We knew that's the case, but that's ready to go. And so next week we will start populating that with containers. Hopefully, I'll see you then. Have a good rest of your day.